So I can remember Pastor Daniel coming to me and saying, hey, I want to do a podcast.
We struggled internally with how do we create discipleship opportunities that connect to people who aren't able to physically be here during the week. We've got a couple of different Bible studies through the week, and what we have learned is that predominantly the people who show up to those are deeply committed Christians who've been deeply committed Christians for a really long time. And so we asked ourselves the question, how can we connect to folks who may be skeptical of church, but are willing to listen to something that may feel a little less intimidating?
And I remember thinking, that's incredible. And I wasn't worried about what we were going to say or figuring out the content. I knew we could do all of that. What I was nervous about was, how do you actually make a podcast? Really, all it takes is a few good mics. And if you've got a Mac, you've already got GarageBand. And then choosing where you want to upload from. And so from there, the Gather, Grow, Go podcast was really born.
Welcome to the Gather, Grow, Go podcast. I'm Pastor Daniel.
I'm Pastor Melissa.
And I'm just Kiefer. Podcasts are like sort of my second faith community. Like honestly, there's a couple that I religiously, really is the right word, listen to. I think podcasts have kind of broken their way into at least the younger generation culture as being sort of a way to engage in conversations about things. And it really can feel like a conversation. When I find people that listen to the same podcasts that I do, you kind of have this instant like, oh, so did you listen to this episode? Yeah, I did. And then you kind of, it's like you've already broken through so many walls and you feel like you've had the same conversation. And so you can pick up from there and then have new conversations bloom from that.
I've had any number of my folks come up to me over the last 6 months that we've been doing this and say, now, I listened to the podcast this week. And the thing that they don't say, but often tell me later, is that our podcast is the first podcast they've ever listened to. And so we see that in a church that longs to be intergenerational, in a church that longs to speak to our teenagers and our octogenarians through this podcast, we are able to speak to people of all generations so that they might grow in their faith in Jesus Christ, so that they may grow in their understanding of who God is and who God has called them to be, and so that they can grow in being deeply committed disciples who help transform the world one life at a time.
Podcast fits into your schedule. You just click on it and you listen when the timing is right for you. I know some people listen to this podcast, they'll let a few of them build up, and then when they're doing their cleaning or if they're cooking, they'll turn it on in their kitchens or in their homes and they'll listen to it. And I know a lot of people listen to our podcast on the road. There's one family in particular that their children are really involved with dance. And that means that there's a lot of Sunday mornings that they miss.
They have dance 3 or 4 days a week. They've got dance competitions on the weekend. They've got lots of different things that keep them really, really busy. But one of the things that has become a formative part of their ongoing spiritual formation and development as a family is that Tuesday afternoons, on their 45-minute drive to dance, they pull out their phone and they listen to the podcast. They listen to the podcast as a family, multiple generations together as one, and then whatever time is left in their journey, they talk through, they break down, they wrestle with what our conversation means for their life.
And they have been so grateful for this podcast because even if they can't worship with their church community on Sunday morning, then they can turn on the Gather, Grow, Go podcast. And the hope is that, maybe even one day too, one of the people who has discovered this podcast because a friend at the church introduced it to them, shared it with them, a person that stumbles upon it because we make sure to hit up all the Cleburne algorithms that we could think of when putting this out, that if that's the first contact that they have with this church, then maybe one day they might call it their church.